The laughter hit me before the sound registered as wrong, because it was familiar in the way your own name is familiar, so deeply wired into your sense of home that your body recognizes it before your brain has time to catch up. And I remember standing there with the back door half open, one hand still wrapped around a beer that had gone warm without me noticing, listening to my wife's laugh float over the fence like it belonged there, like it had every right to be carried by the night air from another man's backyard. And in that suspended moment, I felt something inside me loosen in a way that terrified me, because it wasn't anger yet. It was the quiet understanding that something essential had already broken long before I was brave enough to look at it directly. It was late enough that the neighborhood had settled into that soft, watchful silence where even small noises feel amplified, and the sound of her laugh came in bursts, followed by his voice, lower and slower, the voice of the neighbor who waved at me every morning with the casual confidence of someone who believed himself decent. And I remember thinking how strange it was that my first instinct was not to confront anyone, but to stand perfectly still, as if moving might shatter the fragile illusion that this was all still fixable. Because once you accept what you are hearing, you cannot unhear it. And the fence between our yards suddenly felt less like a boundary and more like a joke we had all been politely pretending was solid. I told myself that laughter was not proof, that voices carried, that people were allowed to exist near each other without meaning anything. But the way her laugh dipped at the end, softened and almost intimate, pulled a memory loose of how she used to sound when she leaned close to me on the couch late at night, her shoulder warm against mine, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the seam of my shirt as if she belonged there. And the realization that I had not heard that sound directed at me in months settled into my chest with a weight that made it hard to breathe, because even denial requires energy, and I was already so tired. When she finally came inside, her cheeks flushed and her movements just a little too deliberate, she acted like nothing had happened, like the house had not been holding its breath waiting for her to cross the threshold. And when I asked where she had been, keeping my voice steady in a way that felt rehearsed even to my own ears, she smiled without warmth and told me she had been talking with the neighbor, as if that explanation should close the subject entirely, as if my discomfort were an inconvenience rather than a warning sign, and something in the way she looked past me instead of at me made it clear that whatever was happening out there did not include me anymore. That night I lay awake listening to her breathe beside me, aware of the exact distance between our bodies and how carefully she maintained it, aware of how the bed felt larger than it ever had before, and my mind kept replaying the sound of her laughter over and over again, not because I wanted to punish myself, but because I was trying to understand when it had stopped belonging to us, when it had become something portable, something she could carry across a fence and offer to someone else without hesitation. And I realized with a clarity that bordered on nausea that this was not a momentary lapse or a misunderstanding waiting to be cleared up, because whatever intimacy creates that kind of sound does not appear overnight. In the days that followed, I started noticing how easily she slipped out of the house after dinner, how defensive she became over her phone, how conversations that used to feel like shared ground now felt like negotiations where I was always expected to concede. And through it all, the neighbor remained a constant presence, mowing his lawn at convenient times, lingering in his driveway just long enough to exchange looks that carried more meaning than any words they bothered to hide. And every small interaction added another crack to the picture I had been clinging to, until it became impossible to ignore that I was standing in the ruins of a marriage that everyone else seemed to have accepted was already over. The worst part was not the suspicion itself, but the way it made me feel invisible, like my role had shifted from partner to obstacle without anyone bothering to inform me of the change. And as I lay there one night listening to the faint echo of laughter drift through the open window again, I understood that this was not just about betrayal, but about choice, about the fact that she was choosing to let me hear it, choosing not to care if I did. And in that understanding, something inside me hardened quietly, because I knew then that whatever came next would not be about saving what we had, but about refusing to disappear politely from a story I had not agreed to leave. The proof didn't arrive like a confession or a dramatic scene that would let me pretend it was all about one awful night, because it came the way rot comes in a house you keep repainting, quietly, patiently, through little soft spots you can't stop stepping on. And the first one was her phone. Not the device itself, but the way she held it like it could burn her if she relaxed her grip. The way the screen went dark the second I entered the room. The way she started taking it with her to places nobody brings a phone unless they are hiding from someone. And I would tell myself I was being paranoid until I caught her smiling at nothing. A private smile that made her cheeks lift and her eyes soften. And it hit me like a slap, because that softness used to belong to me. And now it looked like a habit she was practicing for someone else. I tried to approach it the normal way, the grown-up way, the way people claim they do when they talk about communication. So one evening while she was rinsing a plate at the sink, her hair pinned up in that careless twist that always exposed the curve of her neck and made me want to step behind her and slide my hands around her waist, I asked her, calmly and carefully, who she was texting so much. And she didn't even turn around fully when she answered. She just tilted her head and said, "You're doing that thing again, the suspicious thing, and it's exhausting." And I said, still trying to keep my voice level, "I'm not asking because I want to fight. I'm asking because I can feel you pulling away, and I don't know what I'm supposed to do with that." And then she finally faced me with an expression that looked rehearsed, like she'd practiced it in the mirror. And she said, "Maybe if you didn't hover like a prison guard, I'd actually want to be here." And that line landed so hard, not because it was clever, but because it was cruel in a way she hadn't been before. A cruelty that felt like permission she'd already given herself. And I remember thinking that when someone starts treating your concern like a character flaw, it's usually because they need you to stop asking questions. After that, the inconsistencies started stacking up with almost comical predictability. Late grocery runs that came home with nothing but a single bag, walks after dinner that returned with her smelling faintly like someone else's cologne mixed with night air, sudden interest in looking presentable for errands she used to do in sweatpants, and one afternoon when she came back from supposedly dropping off something at a friend's, I caught the neighbor's name in her mouth without her meaning to say it, a slip that made her eyes widen for a fraction of a second before she recovered, and that fraction of a second was the first time I saw real fear on her face, not fear of losing me, but fear of being caught. I started paying attention in a way that felt humiliating, like I was becoming a smaller version of myself, and I hated it. But every time I told myself to stop, some new detail would shove me forward, like the night she left her phone on the couch when she went to shower, and it lit up with a notification that wasn't a name, just a single initial and a heart emoji, and I didn't pick it up right away because my hands actually shook, not from rage, but from that sick anticipation that makes your body beg you to walk away. And then another message popped in, longer this time, and I saw enough without even unlocking it, a line about how she looked dangerous in that dress, and how he couldn't stop thinking about her mouth. And it was strangely worse because it wasn't explicit enough to be obscene. It was intimate enough to be real. I didn't confront her immediately, because shock does this thing where it turns you into a statue, and I sat there listening to the shower run, staring at the phone like it was a live wire, and all I could think was how confident he must feel to talk to my wife like that while she was in my house, how bold she must be to let him. And in that moment, I understood something that made my stomach twist, which was that the betrayal wasn't only physical. It was the way they were building a private world where I was a background character, and the next day I proved it to myself with the kind of quiet investigation I never thought I'd be capable of. I checked our shared account and noticed small withdrawals that didn't match any bills, amounts that looked innocent until you added them up, and I looked at the calendar on the kitchen wall and realized how many of her walks happened on the same nights he was home alone. And then I did the thing I'm not proud of, but I also won't pretend I regret, which was that I opened the smart doorbell app we both had access to, and I scrolled through clips until my eyes felt dry and my throat felt raw. Because there she was more than once, leaving the house dressed like she was going somewhere that mattered, glancing left and right like she was checking for witnesses, and then slipping through his side gate with a speed that made it clear she'd done it before. The final clip was the one that sealed it, not because it showed anything graphic, but because it showed everything that mattered. His back door opening as if he'd been waiting, the way she stepped into him without hesitation, the way his hand went to her lower back like it belonged there, the way her face tipped up toward his and her posture softened into that familiar surrender I used to think was ours, and I watched it with the sound off and still felt like I could hear her laugh. I confronted her that night, not screaming, not throwing things, just standing in the living room with my phone in my hand like it weighed 100 pounds. And when she walked in, I said, I know where you've been, and I know who you've been with, and I need you to stop lying to my face. And she tried to play dumb at first, her eyes narrowing like she could bully reality into changing. But when I said his name out loud, she flinched, and then she did something that hurt more than denial, which was that she sighed like I was a tedious problem finally demanding attention. And she said, You were going to find out eventually. So yes, I've been seeing him. And no, I'm not going to apologize for wanting to feel wanted. And I remember the room spinning slightly because of how casually she said it, like the destruction of our life together was just her finally choosing herself. I asked, How long? And she shrugged in a way that made my hands go cold, and she said, Long enough that you should have noticed. And that sentence, that one sentence, was the moment I stopped thinking of this as something that happened to me and started understanding it as something they were doing on purpose, right next door, in full view of the fence, assuming I would swallow it because that was easier for everyone. She didn't drag it out or collapse into tears the way I'd always assumed these moments happened, because the morning after I confronted her, she moved through the house with a clipped efficiency that made it clear she had already rehearsed leaving me in her head, and I watched her pull suitcases out of the closet with the same hands that used to tug my shirt off when she wanted me, folding clothes with sharp, impatient movements, as if the real inconvenience wasn't what she'd done, but that I was still there to witness it. And when I asked what she thought she was doing, my voice cracking in a way I hated, she said she was being practical, that there was no point pretending this was salvageable now that everything was out in the open, and I remember saying, You're really just going to walk out like this? And she didn't even pause. She just said, I'm not walking out, I'm moving on. As if those were the same thing, as if the years we spent building a life together could be reduced to a bad apartment lease she was finally allowed to break. I asked if she felt anything at all, if there was even a shred of guilt buried under that cool certainty, and she laughed softly in a way that didn't reach her eyes and told me guilt was something people used to keep themselves stuck, that she deserved to be happy, that this had just happened, and that if I was honest with myself, I'd admit our marriage had been dying anyway. And hearing her reframe months of deception as an unfortunate but natural progression felt like being told my house burned down because I forgot to water the lawn. The neighbor showed up that afternoon under the pretense of returning a borrowed tool, his timing so precise it almost felt coordinated, and when I opened the door and saw him standing there with that same easy posture, that same practiced concern, something ugly rose in my throat because this was the man who had been slipping his hands onto my wife's body while nodding at me over the fence like we were part of the same harmless routine, and he started with, I'm really sorry things turned out this way, in a tone that suggested fate rather than choice, and I said, Don't do that. Don't stand in my doorway and pretend this is some accident you tripped into. And he lifted his hands slightly like he was calming an animal, telling me he hadn't planned any of it, that feelings developed, that adults were allowed to make complicated decisions. And I could hear my wife moving around upstairs, zippers opening and closing, and the normalcy of those sounds against the absurdity of this conversation made my head spin. I asked him if he had any idea what it felt like to smile at someone every morning while sleeping with their spouse at night, and he swallowed and said he understood why I was angry, but that this wasn't about me, that it was about what he and my wife felt together. And that sentence lodged itself somewhere deep and poisonous, because it confirmed what I'd suspected all along, which was that in their story, I was already a footnote, an obstacle they'd stepped over without much thought. When she finally came down the stairs, suitcase in hand, she didn't look at me the way someone looks when they're leaving something painful behind. She looked relieved, and she told me she'd be staying with him for a while until they figured out their next steps, saying it like a reasonable plan instead of a fresh insult. And I asked, You couldn't even give it a week. You couldn't pretend this mattered enough to leave with some dignity. And she rolled her eyes and said, Dignity is subjective, before adding, almost as an afterthought, that she hoped we could be civil, because she didn't want this to get ugly with the neighbors watching. I stood there in the entryway as she walked past me, close enough that I caught the familiar scent of her perfume mixed with his cologne, a combination that made my stomach clench. And I realized then that there would be no apology worth hearing, no explanation that would give me closure, because she had already rewritten the story in a way that allowed her to leave without carrying the weight of what she'd done. And as the door closed behind them and their footsteps faded toward the house next door, I was left alone in a space that still felt like ours but no longer belonged to me, understanding with a clarity that was almost calming that whatever came next would not involve asking for answers from people who had decided I didn't deserve them. The neighborhood didn't explode the way I imagined it might, with confrontations and shouted loyalties, because it did something worse and chose comfort over truth, and within days I could feel the shift in the air every time I stepped outside, the way conversations lowered when I passed, the way smiles turned careful and brittle, as if my presence reminded people of something they preferred not to think about, and I heard about myself secondhand through phrases that floated back to me like smoke. Things like how it was sad, but these things happen, how she seemed happier now, how the neighbor had always been such a nice guy, and the most cutting of all, how nobody really knew what went on inside a marriage, which was a convenient way of saying they had decided not to know. I ran into people I'd shared barbecues with, people who had sat at my table and laughed at my jokes, and they asked how I was doing in that tone that expects a polite lie, and when I answered honestly by saying I was struggling, they shifted uncomfortably and offered vague encouragements about time and healing, as if the real problem was my continued reaction rather than the betrayal itself. And the more this happened, the more I realized how easily people adapt to new versions of reality when it allows them to stay neutral, because neutrality feels like kindness when you don't want to choose a side. My wife and the neighbor didn't hide, which was perhaps the most humiliating part, because they moved through the block like a newly sanctioned couple, appearing together at the corner store, laughing openly on his porch, her hand resting on his arm in a way that felt deliberately visible, and I watched from my window one evening as they shared a bottle of wine in his backyard, sitting close enough that their knees touched, and I felt that familiar twist of attraction and anger collide inside me, because she still looked like the woman I had loved. Her body still moved in ways my mind responded to automatically, and I hated myself for noticing, for wanting, for feeling that pull even as resentment burned just beneath it. Someone eventually had the decency, or perhaps the cruelty, to tell me what was being said when I wasn't around, how she'd framed the story as a mutual drifting apart, how she'd hinted that I'd been distant, controlling, emotionally unavailable, and I confronted her about it the next time she came to collect more of her things, standing in the living room that echoed now without her presence, and I said, "You don't get to rewrite me into a villain just so you can feel better about what you did." And she crossed her arms and told me I was being dramatic, that she was just telling her truth, that people were allowed to see things differently. And when I said, "Your truth conveniently leaves out the months of lying and sneaking around next door," she snapped back that I was obsessed, that I needed to stop fixating on details, that none of this would have happened if our marriage had been fulfilling. And the way she said fulfilling, slow and pointed, carried an implication that felt like a final insult. I noticed then how comfortable she had become speaking to me that way, how little restraint she showed, and it dawned on me that the support she felt from the neighborhood, from the quiet acceptance of her new life, had emboldened her, had convinced her that this was already settled, that I was the unreasonable one for not moving on fast enough. And as she walked out again, leaving behind the faint imprint of her presence, I understood that the social damage was not accidental, but structural, built on the simple fact that people prefer a neat ending, even if it's a lie, and that by refusing to play along, by remaining visibly hurt and uncooperative with the narrative, I had positioned myself as an inconvenience in their collective story. The knock came late enough that my first thought was that something terrible had happened, because nobody arrives at that hour unless they are either desperate or reckless. And when I opened the door, I wasn't prepared for the way the night air rushed in, carrying the smell of rain and someone else's perfume, or for the sight of her standing there with her shoulders drawn tight and her hands clenched together like she was bracing for impact. The neighbor's daughter, unmistakably older than the secret assumptions my mind tried to make in a split second, her face lit by the porch light in a way that made her look both nervous and determined. And she said my name carefully as if she'd practiced it, then asked if we could talk somewhere private, because she didn't want her father to see her standing there. I remember stepping aside without thinking, watching her take in the house with a glance that lingered just long enough to feel intimate, like she was stepping into a story she already knew parts of. And when she sat on the edge of the couch instead of sinking into it, when she tucked one leg under herself and smoothed her jacket as if buying time, I felt that strange flicker of awareness you get when someone is close to you in a quiet room. Not desire exactly, but a charged attention, sharpened by the fact that she did not belong there, and yet seemed entirely sure she had a right to be. She didn't start with an apology or a warning, which would have been easier, because instead she took a breath and said, "I know this is going to sound unbelievable, but I think you deserve to hear it from someone who isn't trying to protect themselves." And the way she said it, steady but tight, made my chest ache in a way I hadn't expected, because it implied she had been carrying this alone for a while. She told me she'd moved back temporarily after a breakup, that she hadn't planned on staying long, and that she'd walked into something that didn't feel right almost immediately, describing late nights, hushed conversations that stopped when she entered a room, the way my wife spoke about me with a casual dismissiveness that made her uncomfortable. And as she talked, she kept meeting my eyes and then looking away again, like she was gauging how much I could take. And I remember noticing the faint tremor in her hands and the way she pressed them together to still them, and thinking that whatever had brought her here had cost her something too. When I asked why she was telling me this instead of staying out of it like everyone else had, she swallowed and said, "Because watching someone rewrite reality while everyone nods along makes you complicit if you stay quiet." And there was something in her voice then that felt like anger braided with shame, and I realized this wasn't just about loyalty to me or betrayal of her father, but about her refusal to let herself become someone she didn't recognize. As the conversation stretched on, the tension in the room shifted from awkward to electric, not because of anything she did overtly, but because of the way honesty can feel intimate when it's rare. And there were moments when our knees nearly touched, when the space between us seemed charged with unspoken understanding, and I was acutely aware of how long it had been since anyone looked at me without expectation or judgment, just attention, and that awareness stirred something complicated and dangerous that I forced myself to keep buried. She stood to leave eventually, lingering by the door like she wasn't sure she'd said enough or too much, and when she looked back at me, she said, "I don't know what you'll do with this," but I couldn't keep pretending none of it mattered. And after she stepped into the night and disappeared down the path, I closed the door and leaned my forehead against it, understanding that whatever line I'd been standing on had just shifted, because the silence I'd been enduring had cracked open, and through it had stepped someone who was no longer willing to play along with the lie that was supposed to make this easier for everyone else. She came back 2 nights later, not with the tentative hesitation of someone unsure, but with the quiet resolve of someone who had decided that whatever discomfort followed was preferable to silence, and we sat at the kitchen table this time with the overhead light dimmed low enough to feel private, her coat draped over the back of a chair as if she might leave at any second if things went wrong, and she started talking without waiting for me to prompt her, telling me that once she allowed herself to really look at what was happening next door, the timeline stopped making sense in a way that felt intentional, because the affair didn't begin when they claimed it did. It began earlier, overlapping with moments when my wife had still been smiling at me across dinner plates, overlapping with family events and ordinary days that had now been quietly contaminated. She told me she'd overheard arguments between them that weren't lovers' quarrels but negotiations, conversations about money and convenience and how to keep things contained until it was safe to make them public. And as she spoke, I could feel my hands curling slowly into fists under the table, not from shock but from recognition, because every evasive answer, every sudden accusation my wife had thrown at me now lined up with this new version of events that made brutal sense. The daughter explained how she'd seen my wife use intimacy like leverage, alternating affection with withdrawal to keep her father off balance, how she'd watched him bend himself into something smaller to keep the peace, and she admitted that part of her anger came from recognizing patterns she'd spent years untangling in her own relationships, the kind where desire and control wear the same face if you don't look closely enough. She told me about the money without embellishment, small transfers framed as loans, expenses justified as temporary help that added up to more than either of them wanted to admit, and she slid her phone across the table to show me screenshots she'd taken when things started to feel wrong. Messages where my wife talked about me like a problem already solved, a logistical hurdle she was managing rather than a person she was betraying, and reading those words felt like pressing on a bruise you didn't know you had, because the contempt in them was casual, almost bored, as if she'd already emotionally left and was just waiting for the circumstances to catch up. There were moments when the air between us felt thick, when our shared focus on the same glowing screen brought our shoulders close enough that I was acutely aware of her presence, the warmth of her body, the way her voice softened when she realized something she was saying hurt me, and that closeness carried a dangerous undercurrent I refused to follow, not because it wasn't there, but because it felt too raw, too soon, and too tangled with everything else. When she finished, she sat back and said quietly that she hadn't come to ask me to do anything specific, that she didn't want to trade one version of manipulation for another, but that she needed me to know the truth because watching her father and my wife construct a narrative that painted themselves as brave and honest, while erasing the damage they caused, made her feel like she was suffocating. I thanked her in a voice that didn't quite sound like mine, and after she left I stayed at that table long after the house had gone silent again, staring at the darkened window that faced the fence between our yards, understanding that what she'd given me wasn't ammunition for some dramatic confrontation, but something quieter and more powerful, which was certainty, the kind that settles in your bones and changes the way you move. Because once you see the full shape of a betrayal, you stop reacting to it and start deciding what parts of yourself you are no longer willing to hand over for free. The damage revealed itself slowly after that, not as one clean betrayal, but as a web of smaller compromises that made my skin crawl the more clearly I saw them. Because once you stop looking away, you start noticing how much has been quietly taken from you. And over the next week, the neighbor's daughter and I spoke more often, sometimes at my kitchen table and sometimes walking the block at dusk when the light made everything look deceptively gentle, and piece by piece we traced the outlines of what had been happening right under my nose. She told me about favors disguised as coincidences, how my wife had positioned herself as indispensable in her father's life, managing errands, organizing schedules, offering emotional support at just the right moments, and how those gestures had created a sense of obligation that blurred into something else before anyone named it. And I started recognizing patterns in my own life, times when money had gone missing from our joint account with explanations that sounded reasonable until you put them side by side, times when my wife had insisted on handling things alone, telling me she didn't want to burden me, when in reality she was building a parallel structure that didn't include me. We sat with bank statements spread across the table one evening, the quiet punctuated only by the hum of the refrigerator, and I remember how strange it felt to lean close to her, our shoulders almost touching as we traced dates and amounts, how that closeness carried a low, unsettling warmth that had nothing to do with what we were discussing, and everything to do with being seen by someone who wasn't dismissing my pain. And when she apologized softly for bringing this into my life, I told her it was already there, that she was just the first person willing to turn on the light. What unsettled me most was how calculated it all looked in hindsight, how my wife had anticipated the fallout and positioned herself to land safely, securing access to money, sympathy, and a ready-made narrative that painted her as brave rather than deceitful, and as the daughter explained how her father had started bending rules at work, pulling strings to cover absences and justify favors that benefited my wife indirectly, I realized the betrayal extended beyond our marriage into systems that relied on trust and quiet compliance. There were moments when the anger surged hot and immediate, when I imagined confronting them with everything laid out neatly, forcing them to account for each lie. But those moments passed, replaced by something colder and more controlled, because the more I learned, the clearer it became that exposure would not require theatrics. It would only require patience. One night after she'd left, I sat alone scrolling through old photos on my phone, pictures of a life that now felt staged, and instead of grief, I felt a strange steadiness settle in, the kind that comes when you finally understand the shape of the problem you're dealing with. The next time the neighbor's daughter came by, she asked what I planned to do, her tone careful, and I surprised myself by answering honestly that I didn't intend to confront anyone yet, that I wanted to let the truth accumulate quietly until it could no longer be contained, and she nodded like she understood, like this made sense to her, and in that shared understanding, there was a flicker of something dangerous and intimate that I acknowledged and then deliberately set aside, because what mattered more than any fleeting comfort was the knowledge that the ground beneath the story they were telling was already crumbling, and all I had to do was stop trying to hold it together for them. The truth didn't erupt the way people imagine it does, with shouting matches and slammed doors, because it came out sideways, carried by ordinary conversations that refused to stay contained, and I wasn't even present when the first crack formed, because the neighbor's daughter confronted her father without warning on a quiet afternoon when the house was empty except for them, and she later told me how she stood in his kitchen with her hands flat on the counter and said she needed him to listen without interrupting, that she was done protecting him from consequences he had chosen, and that the story he was telling about bravery and love did not match what she had witnessed, and according to her he tried to soften it at first, saying adults make mistakes, saying feelings are complicated, saying he never meant to hurt anyone, and she replied in a voice that surprised even herself, that intention does not erase impact, that she had watched him rationalize dishonesty until it became a habit, that she had seen my wife speak about me as if I were an inconvenience rather than a person, and that she refused to participate in a lie that required her silence to survive. She told me he went pale in a way she'd never seen, not because he was ashamed, but because he finally understood that the version of events he relied on was no longer under his control, and when she mentioned money, dates, and the conversations she'd overheard, his denial fractured into defensiveness, his voice rising as he accused her of betrayal, of choosing a stranger over family, and she told him calmly that integrity wasn't a side you picked when it was convenient, that if he wanted her loyalty, he should have earned it by behaving like someone worthy of it, and that if he continued pretending this was a harmless love story, she would correct the record wherever it mattered. From there it moved quickly, not in a dramatic sweep, but in a series of quiet recalibrations, because when she spoke to extended family she didn't exaggerate or editorialize, she simply told the timeline as she knew it, told them when the affair really began, told them about the financial overlap and the way my wife and her father had coordinated their narrative, and people who had been comfortable staying neutral suddenly found themselves asking questions they hadn't wanted to ask before. I started receiving messages that felt tentative and awkward, acquaintances asking if we could talk, mutual friends admitting they'd been told a very different story, and when my wife finally confronted me, storming into the house unannounced with anger sharpened by panic, she accused me of poisoning people against her, and I listened quietly as she spoke because I realized something then that felt like a small, private victory, which was that I didn't need to defend myself at all. I told her, evenly and without heat, that I hadn't told anyone anything that wasn't true, that the story was collapsing because it couldn't support its own weight, and that if she was angry, it was because she'd built her new life on the assumption that everyone else would carry the discomfort for her, and she stared at me like she was seeing a stranger, because for the first time I wasn't reacting to her version of events. I was simply standing outside it. She left furious, and within days the relationship next door started showing cracks I could see even from a distance, conversations that turned sharp and clipped, doors closing harder than necessary, the careful choreography of public affection giving way to visible strain, and I understood then that the most effective part of all of this was not exposure or confrontation, but the refusal to intervene, because by allowing the truth to travel without my fingerprints on it, I let their own choices finish the work they had started, and in that restraint there was a deep, steady satisfaction that felt earned rather than stolen. By the time their relationship began to crack openly, I was no longer surprised by anything I saw, because collapse has a sound and a rhythm once you learn how to listen for it, and it started with the arguments I could hear through the open windows on warm evenings, voices raised not in passion but in irritation, the kind that comes from two people who rushed toward each other believing chemistry would solve everything, and are now discovering that secrecy doesn't translate into stability. I watched from a distance as the choreography of their togetherness unraveled, the public displays thinning out, the laughter disappearing, replaced by clipped exchanges and long silences that stretched across driveways and dinner tables. And I knew without needing confirmation that the same dishonesty that made the affair possible was now turning inward, because people who build intimacy on lies eventually have nothing left to stand on once the excitement fades. The neighbor began coming home later, his car idling in the driveway like he wasn't ready to face whatever waited inside, while my wife started appearing alone more often, her posture tighter, her movements sharper, and I felt an unexpected calm settle over me as I realized I was no longer the axis their world spun around, no longer the obstacle they blamed for their discomfort. The first time she came back to the house unannounced after things started going wrong next door, she looked smaller somehow, not physically, but in the way her certainty had eroded, and she stood in the doorway talking too fast about misunderstandings and stress and how none of this was as simple as it looked from the outside, and I listened with a strange detachment as she tried to draw me back into the role of emotional buffer, the person who would absorb her confusion and reassure her that she was still good, still justified. And when she finally paused, waiting for me to say something that would anchor her, I told her quietly that I wasn't part of this anymore, that whatever they were dealing with belonged to them, and the look on her face in that moment wasn't anger or sadness, but shock, because she had assumed I would always be available to steady her when the ground shifted. After she left, slamming the door harder than necessary, I realized that this refusal, this simple boundary, was more destabilizing to her than any confrontation could have been, because it forced her to sit with the consequences of her choices without an audience willing to cushion the fall. The neighbor's daughter filled me in on the rest in fragments over the following weeks, conversations held while walking or sitting in parked cars, the kind of spaces where people tell the truth because there's nowhere else to put it, and she described how her father cycled between defensiveness and self-pity, how he accused my wife of pressuring him even as he clung to her out of habit rather than affection, how the financial strain they'd ignored began to surface in sharp arguments about responsibility and blame. And I listened without offering solutions because there was nothing left for me to fix. There were moments when the weight of it all pressed close again, when the intimacy of those conversations stirred something complicated between us, a mutual awareness born from shared disillusionment and late-night honesty. But we never crossed that line, not because it wasn't tempting, but because neither of us wanted to replace one messy entanglement with another, and that restraint felt like its own quiet act of defiance against the chaos we'd both witnessed. From my side of the fence, the end came not with a bang, but with a slow fade. Fewer cars in the driveway, more nights spent elsewhere, and eventually the unmistakable sound of packing again, this time not mine. And I stood in my kitchen one evening watching the lights next door flicker off one by one, understanding that I had reached the point where their implosion no longer felt like revenge but like inevitability. I hadn't exposed them, hadn't shouted or demanded apologies, hadn't forced anyone to choose sides, and yet here it was, the outcome unfolding exactly as it would when people mistake desire for foundation and secrecy for strength. And in that realization there was a deep, steady satisfaction, not the sharp thrill of seeing someone punished, but the quieter relief of knowing that by stepping back, by refusing to prop up a lie that wasn't mine to carry, I had finally allowed the truth to do what it always does when left alone long enough, which is to finish the job without asking for permission. By the time the noise settled, I realized how much of my energy had been tied up in reacting to other people's choices, because suddenly there was nothing left to react to, only space. And that space felt strange at first, like standing in a room after the music stops and noticing the ringing in your ears. And I filled it the way people do when they don't yet trust quiet, by reorganizing drawers that didn't need it, by taking longer routes home, by staying busy enough that I didn't have to sit with the question of who I was now that I wasn't someone being wronged in real time. People started reaching out again, slowly and awkwardly, messages that opened with apologies that were never quite specific enough to be satisfying, friends admitting they hadn't known what to say, neighbors explaining that they hadn't wanted to get involved, and I listened without correcting them, because I understood then that their discomfort wasn't mine to manage anymore, and there was a small, private power in letting them feel it without offering reassurance. My wife tried once more, weeks later, showing up unexpectedly with a softness she hadn't used on me in months, talking about closure and healing and how she hoped we could eventually be friends. And as she spoke, I noticed how carefully she avoided responsibility, how even now she framed everything as a mutual failure rather than a series of choices she'd made. And I told her, calmly and without anger, that friendship requires honesty and respect, that we hadn't ended because we grew apart, but because she chose something else while pretending she hadn't, and that I wasn't interested in smoothing over that reality for her comfort. And when she left this time, there was no drama, just the quiet understanding that whatever version of me she'd expected to find no longer existed. What surprised me most was how my own narrative began to shift once I stopped explaining myself to anyone. Because without the constant need to justify my pain, it softened into something more manageable, something that didn't define every thought, and I started noticing small things again, the way the house felt lighter with fewer echoes of someone who resented being there, the way mornings stretched out without tension, the way my body relaxed in places I hadn't realized were always tight. The neighbor's daughter remained a presence in my life, not as a constant, but as someone who checked in occasionally. Our conversations easier now that the crisis had passed, and there was still an awareness between us, a quiet recognition of what we'd shared, but it felt grounded rather than charged, like two people who had seen the same storm from different windows and didn't need to relive it to understand each other. I found myself telling the story less, not because it hurt too much, but because it mattered less, because it had stopped being the axis everything turned on, and when people asked how I was doing, I could answer honestly without feeling like I was betraying myself by moving forward. Rewriting my own narrative didn't happen all at once. It happened in these small, unremarkable moments where I chose not to look over the fence, not to wonder what they were doing, not to measure my progress against their failures, and each of those choices added up to something solid and quiet that felt like mine. I didn't feel triumphant or vindicated in the way stories promise you will after betrayal, but I felt steady, and that steadiness was more valuable than any dramatic victory, because it meant I was no longer living in reaction to someone else's decisions, no longer framing my life as the aftermath of theirs. And as I stood one evening in the kitchen watching the light fade across the yard, I understood that the most lasting part of what I'd gained wasn't revenge or validation, but authorship. The simple, powerful ability to decide what mattered next without asking permission from anyone who had already shown me they weren't willing to protect what we had built together. The house sounded different once everything finally stopped moving around it. Not empty exactly, but settled, like a place that had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. And I noticed it most in the evenings when the light fell across the living room without anyone arguing about lamps or television volume, when I could sit on the couch and feel the quiet without immediately filling it with noise or distraction. The neighbor's place changed too, slowly and then all at once, cars disappearing for days at a time, lights left off in rooms that used to glow late into the night, and eventually the unmistakable thud of boxes being loaded when his life began contracting instead of expanding. And I didn't watch out of spite or curiosity so much as acknowledgement, the way you notice weather moving through a familiar landscape without needing to interpret it as a sign. My wife reached out one final time through a message that tried very hard to sound reflective, talking about lessons learned and growth and how she hoped we could someday look back without bitterness. And I read it twice before realizing I didn't feel anything sharp at all, just a mild sadness for how committed she remained to smoothing over consequences with language, and I didn't reply, not because I wanted to punish her, but because there was nothing left to clarify. The neighbor's daughter and I crossed paths one afternoon by chance, both of us surprised and oddly relieved by the ordinariness of it. And we talked for a while in the open air about work and plans and small future things that had nothing to do with the mess that brought us together. And when she said she was moving away soon, not dramatically but with a quiet sense of direction, I felt proud of her in a way that wasn't tangled or complicated, just respect for someone who chose integrity even when it cost her comfort. And when we said goodbye, it felt complete, not like something left unresolved. What remained after all the noise was not triumph or revenge in the way people imagine it, but clarity, the kind that settles deep and stays put. And I realized that the satisfaction everyone asks about, didn't come from watching them unravel, but from noticing how little their unraveling mattered to my daily life once I stopped orbiting it. I started making decisions without running them through the filter of what had happened, stopped measuring my progress against anyone else's collapse, and the freedom in that felt earned rather than gifted, like something built slowly through restraint instead of impulse. There were moments when memory flared unexpectedly, a laugh overheard somewhere that sounded like hers, a fence line catching my eye at dusk. But those moments passed without dragging me under, because they no longer defined the present. They were just evidence of where I'd been. Standing alone in the kitchen one evening, the same place where so many hard conversations had ended without resolution, I felt something close to gratitude, not for the betrayal, but for the honesty it forced, because nothing I have now rests on pretense or silence or the hope that someone else will behave better if I endure quietly enough. I didn't win anything they lost, didn't take something that belonged to them. I simply stepped out of a story that required my erasure to make sense, and in doing so, I found myself standing in a life that finally felt proportionate to who I am, quieter, cleaner, and undeniably mine, even if it came at a cost I never would have chosen. Because some endings don't arrive to teach you a lesson, they arrive to clear the space where something truer can finally take root.